All right, so today is August 8th. It is 8/8, 808, 808 day. Sometimes people who are huge fucking nerds celebrate the TR-808 drum machine on August 8th, 808. I just recently got a power adapter replacement for my turntable after over a year of not having access to my turntable, so I wasn't able to play my records. And to celebrate 808 Day, I decided to listen to a couple of records in my collection that prominently feature the 808 drum machine in some way. And I wound up pulling together a selection of 4 records that actually kind of chronicle the history of the 808 drum machine and how it went from being this specific drum machine that was pretty a commercial failure at first, became cheap on the second-hand market, got used in a lot of really important records at the forefront of some really new, exciting genres of music in the 80s and the 90s. And then it became not really a drum machine, but a set of sounds and like a way of doing electronic drums. Got 4 right here. They're not, if I were to pick a definitive selection of records to like chart the history of the 808 drum machine, it would not be the 4 records that I'm about to talk about here. I got them all here. But the fact is that these are just records that I happen to own personally. Like, if I really wanted to go in depth about the 808 drum machine, obviously you have to talk about like Sexual Healing, Planet Rock, Egyptian Lover. I would definitely put, like, for a full length record that prominently features the 808, the album Baseline by Mantronix is just like one of the most, in my opinion, definitive like 808 records that I can think of. It's a classic sort of 80s electro kind of hip-hop album, very much in the vein of like Africa Bambaataa and that kind of stuff, which was very synth heavy, very sort of dance oriented version of hip-hop. But unfortunately I don't own any of those records. But what I do own is this. This is Steve, I normally know his name. This J.M. Silk. Steve Silk Hurley, I think. For some reason my brain auto-corrected to Steve Harvey, which completely different person. But he was a pioneer of Chicago house music, and this record was one of the first Chicago house records to really go outside of the underground sort of like local Chicago club scene. It went national, it went international, it was, I believe, somewhat of a big hit in the UK, and played a big role in bringing house music to the UK, where it would become, just so huge. And, in England, they would put their own spin on house music and make a lot of great classic records from it. But this is Music is the Key by J.M. Silk. This has 4 different versions of it. It has on the B side a radio edit and a percussion / acapella sort of thing, just a tool for DJs to use for transitions and mashups and stuff like that. But then on the A side is where the real meat is, and it has the 2 primary mixes for this song: Music is the Key house key and Music is the Key basement key. Music is the Key house key is sort of the main mix of the song, and it features I don't know if it even features any 808 drum sounds on it. It's more of a straightforward, more sort of in your face, kind of bigger sounding track. It features a very prominent vocal. It puts a lot more emphasis on the sort of organ line that carries throughout the track. And it features a kick drum, which is more sort of, I would assume it comes from a drum machine that is sample based, whereas the TR-808 is synthesis based. It's all internal synthesis hardware generating those sounds, whereas a lot of other common drum machines and a lot of more standard drum machines like the LinnDrum are based on samples, and they have that sort of heavier, weightier, thicker, punchier, louder, more organic sort of drum sound, whereas the TR-808, being based in synthesis and with just the way that it does its synthesis, has a smaller, more sort of tinny, generally speaking, drum sound. It is, I think, a lot. It feels weird to say because when we think of the 808, we think of the kick drum, and we particularly think of the version of the kick drum that came to be used as like this huge sub bass drop. But if you really think about the 808 drum machine compared to other drum machines, the sounds have a much more limited frequency range and tend to be not subtler, not even necessarily more quiet, but they have a very distinct timbre. And on the secondary mix, which is more of a sort of like deep house or proto deep house track, music is the key, basement key, you see just all throughout its 808 drum machines. And listening back to house key versus basement key, you can really see what sets the 808 apart from other commercially available drum machines at the time and really to this day, and how that sound stood out so well, and how, you know, Steve Hurley really leaned into this super unique sound to create this more sort of laid back, atmospheric, almost cerebral sound that you couldn't get from these bigger, more in-your-face drum machines. And it creates a totally unique sound, totally unique texture, totally unique palette that is really, really great. You listen to the kick drum on basement key, and it's this very round, sort of thumpy, like kind of tone. But it is very different from a lot of what you would see later on with the drum machine, especially in terms of hip hop, which brings us to the second record that I wanted to talk about, and the second record that I listened to today, which is the classic Dr. Dre's The Chronic. When you think of this record, you don't really typically think of the 808 drum machine. If I were to describe the sound of the Chronic, I would think of, you know, first, obviously, the sort of Moog sounds that were all over this record, with both the sort of like saw wave basses that you see on a track like Dre Day, as well as the sort of high-pitched square and like triangle and sine wave leads that became just super essential sounds in G-Funk. And then you also have the sort of relaxed, sort of West Coast, very almost kind of jazzy samples on a track like Nothing But a G Thing. But if you really listen to this album and you listen closely to the drums, a lot of it is sampled breaks. A lot of it is those more organic sample-based sounds that you would see from classic hip-hop drum machines like the SP1200. But there are a lot of 808 or 808 style sounds in the mix there as well. In particular, I noticed that there's a lot of 808 hi-hats and a lot of 808 ride cymbals on this album. You listen to the sort of hi-hat that you would see on like a LinnDrum or an SP1200. It's a bit lower in pitch. It's got a bit more dirt on it. It's got a bit sort of wider of a sound. Again, much lower in pitch. Not as bright as the 808, which is very high-end, very clicky, very sharp, very precise, very limited frequency range, which I think lends to one of this album's biggest strengths, which is in the mixing and mastering. There is incredible separation in this mix, the way that each frequency range and each sort of frequency band has its own space to breathe and to move and to really hit in a distinct way, and that brings a lot of clarity to the record, but it also allows the record to have a lot of volume and a lot of presence, and it allows it to have that really thick, deep bass, which if you just listen to this album on like an iPhone speaker or something like that, you're not getting as much detail as you would get if you're listening to it on really nice speakers, especially this sort of vinyl pressing of it. I was really kind of astounded by how great this album sounds when I listened to it today. It's been a while since I've listened to it in any capacity. And you'll see a lot of not usage of the 808 as a primary kick, not usage of the 808 for its clap sounds or for its snare sounds, but you see the 808 as kind of a support thing. You see it acting as kind of a sub bass in addition to a sort of Moog saw bass or an electric bass that would be played by a live player or taken from a sample off of a record. And it winds up having this sort of like the secondary bass role where it's below the main bass in the track, and it adds that real big oomph and that real big boom sound. Which brings me to the third record I wanted to talk about, which is Mystic Styles by 3 6 Mafia, one of my favorite records of all times, and also a record that, as far as I know, does not contain an actual TR-808 anywhere on the album. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it for a couple of reasons. So, as with most sort of 90s Memphis rap albums and these like Memphis horrorcore tapes and stuff, the main drum machine used here was the Boss DR660, which contained a lot of different drum samples. It contained a lot of those really sort of low-pitched, punchy in the face kind of snare sounds, but it also contained samples from the TR-808, and it also had the capacity for you to individually pitch each drum sound and sort of create a melodic sequence with those drum sounds, which led to the pioneering of that sort of melodic 808 bass line that you see all over not just trap music today, not just hip-hop music today, but across really all genres of music. It's been said many times that trap music is kind of the defining sound of the 2010s, and I totally agree with that take. And you can see the really, really early sort of germs of that in this album and in any sort of Memphis tapes from around here. You can also see it in a lot of contemporary records that were coming out of, I would argue, New Orleans as well, particularly the Cash Money Camp. Also in places like Texas, you had UGK around that time dealing with a sound that wasn't quite the same as the Memphis sound, but which was definitely veering in that direction with that sort of slower, very drum machine-esque, drum machine-centric, moving away from the breaks, similar sort of tempo, similar sort of rhythms. And I think that the fact that this record uses the Boss DR660 Dr. Rhythm as opposed to an actual 808 is really, really significant. Not just because of the tuning aspect of it, but because it sees the start of this shift where on something like Basement Key, on something like, those early electro albums from Mantronix, from, Afrika Bambaataa, Egyptian Lover, all those sorts of things, all those early house records, even something like presumably The Chronic, you have people recording directly from an 808 unit that they presumably got for fairly cheap because it was going for super low prices on the secondhand market. By the mid-90s, when this was being created, the 808, as far as I would assume at least, had jumped up significantly in price because now it was in demand. Now there were, whole genres of music that built their sound partially on the 808. Suddenly the price goes up in value. Suddenly it goes from being hyper accessible to these sort of young, up and coming, often, very low income musicians and producers, to being something that you need a bit of a budget to actually access. So these lower end drum machines like the DR660 step in and introduce the sort of maybe not even second, but like third life of the 808 drum machine, where it goes from being a commercial failure that appeared on a couple of like R&B and rock records in the like early 80s to being this sort of secondhand market underground sensation to now being something where people aren't even using an 808, they're using something else to sample or otherwise imitate an 808, which really brings you to the modern sound of trap music, where you listen to a contemporary trap record, nobody is hooking up an 808 drum machine and recording off of it. What they're doing is they're taking sample packs, which are taken from, resample after resample after resample after resample from God knows what source, being put in a zip file and shared amongst producers over, at this point, decades, creating these sort of simulacrum of the original 808 drum machine that's been processed so many times over and over and over, so that the sound evolves, so that the snares sound identifiable in some way, but in another way totally different, to where the 808s have fully moved away from being a kick drum and towards being a synth bass. And instead of having that super deep, subby, it's almost inaudible unless you have subwoofers kind of sound, you've had this movement towards 808s getting more and more distorted, having more and more high end brought out, having, being more and more compressed so that they can be audible on lower budget sound setups. Get to the sound of modern trap music, which I have chosen to represent through Blade's Red Light. I think that Drain Gang is super influential. Drain Gang is an ideal representative of modern hip hop, of modern trap music, of the modern underground, of like the SoundCloud or like post SoundCloud era. I'm a huge Drain Gang fan. I'm a huge Blade fan. This is not my only Blade vinyl. This is not even my favorite Blade album that I own on vinyl. That would probably be Ever Since, but I think that this is the album that is most in line with trap as a sound and as an ethos, out of, maybe not out of Blade's entire discography, but out of the Blade albums that I personally happen to own, definitely. I'd put Working on Dying or Ice Dancer over this and that sort of criteria, but this is really emblematic of what the 808 has become, which, like I said, it's become this like weird sort of copy of a copy of a copy, to the point where you listen to the 808 drum machines, drum sounds on here versus here, totally different, totally indistinguishable. Even comparing this to this, completely different sound, completely different thing. And I think that speaks to the enduring legacy of the 808 and how the 808 wasn't just a drum machine. The 808 was a completely new approach to music making, to percussion sounds, towards what music could be, where, like a lot of what Sophie used to talk about, it's not about, making a one-to-one facsimile of a sound that exists already, but it's about creating something totally new using synthesizers and using technologies. The 808 drum machine sounds like nothing that occurs in nature, and that's what drew people to it. You can't get that sort of subtle, like deep house sound that you see on Music is the Key Basement Key with a drum kit, or even with like a more conventional drum machine that's based on samples like the LinnDrum, like the SP1200, which came later, but whatever. It brought this sort of like level of arranging and of detail and of complexity in production to a record like The Chronic that you can't get from just playing on a drum machine. You can't even get with an orchestra. You need to harness the power of this technology to get there. And then it gets filtered through something like 3 6 Mafia and the underground, and it gets resampled and reprocessed and turned into something different still, until you get these hyper futuristic sounds on a record like Red Light from Blade. And I think that's why the 808 has continued to endure and why it's still so beloved and so celebrated. It's so distinct, it's ever evolving. It represents more than just one single machine. It represents like a whole world in of itself. It represents a whole like different approach to making music, and that's what's so beautiful about it. So yeah, this was super rambly. I'm not really good at talking off the cuff. I get super excited when I talk about music, and especially about like nerdy music tech type stuff, but you know, all right.